Right.
Good to go.
Mhm.
Call to order 6:31 on June 10th. It's 20 today. The Community Finance Committee, D200. Roll call.
Mr. Rodriguez,
Here.
Mr. Brisler,
Here.
Mr. Davis, the three of us, and Ms. Ferrero.
Here.
Mr. Einhardt,
Here.
Dr. Johnson,
Here.
Mr. Kohler,
Here.
Mr. Miller,
Here.
Dr. O'Dale.
Here.
And we also have Mr. Spatz via Zoom.
All right.
I'm here remotely.
That brings us to item 2, approval of the March 11th, 2025 Community Finance Meeting minutes. First and second. Cal as well.
Good evening, Mr. Davis.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, first and second for the minutes.
So moved. So approved.
Second.
Kathleen and Steve, any changes, anybody? No, all right, all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? No, all right, motion carries. That brings us to item 3, public comment. I don't see anything.
None for tonight, via Zoom, via written minutes or in person.
All right, perfect. We move on, to item 4, 4A, introduction of the new committee members. I'm gonna roll off of. Right here, yeah, we roll off, okay, I'm gonna roll off. Right, we show you that roll off. The members do, so. Bob, where you go, Bob, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You just want to do a brief introduction of yourself? The new
Oh, okay.
the new committee
Um,
member.
Sure. I most relevant to this, I served on the District 97 school board from 2007, 2019. Was a member of their Fork Finance Oversight and Review Committee from its inception in 2007 or 8 till 2014 or 15 when I was replaced. I served on District 200 Finance Committee. I can't remember its exact name, but somewhere in the 2012, 2013 time range. Have been involved in various other community nonprofit activities, including I'm on the advisory board for Imagine, am on the Ping board, and the Oak Park and River Forest Youth Ultimate organization, and was among the founding members of the Collaboration for Early Childhood. All 4 of those organizations do some level of business with the high school, so just for full transparency.
Thank you, Bob. Also our other new member, Michelle Hamden, walked in. Michelle, do you want to go ahead and give an introduction for yourself?
Sorry, I was just walking around the school trying to find this room.
I hit the button at the bottom of the video. It's me, thank you.
My name is Michelle Turner-Mangan. I am an O'Hara parent of 2. We have been in the district for about 10 years, and I served on the D97 Finance, Community Finance Committee for about 6 years. My professional expertise is in school finance reform. I help bring the evidence-based model to Illinois, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, thank you. Also, thank you, Petra, for your service.
3.5 years.
3.5
I
years.
was looking back to see, end of 2021.
So it's your
Time
last,
flies when you're having a great time.
Yep, so
You're getting
you're-
lots of things done, so.
yep, so this is your last official meeting, so feel free to go all out. See what you can say.
Go out with a bang.
Yeah. Technically Kathleen's a roll off too, but now she's a board member, so. Now she can grill us like Graham does in the next.
First term.
Yep. Yeah, different perspective for you now, so. All right, that brings us to item B, the capital.
Chris, before we jump on, I just want to, even though timing is a little bit unique with, the board turnover already, but just, want to thank, Mr. Fossey for his years of service on this board. He's really pushed for, finding the right harmony of what's best for the district and protecting the community taxpayers, and, he has done an awful lot of good for this community. So just wanted to take a quick second to say thank you to him.
And I'd also like to add just really quickly for anybody keeping score at home, just as a point of clarity. That our two new board members, shall have not been officially approved by the Board of Education. That will occur in 2 days. And so they're here tonight as our guests to participate in the conversation. But it's something that will happen in 40 hours.
All right, I'll chime in one last comment. I want to thank Tony for running a terrific process of finding us some really excellent members for the CFC. So I'm really looking forward to their contributions, and great job, Tony, getting that done. And also Petra, we look forward to your mic drop tonight at the end of the meeting.
Okay, that brings us item 4B, capital plan funding. That would be.
Okay, so, I know you've all studied the packets that, Lisa provided, and actually, on this agenda, items B through D are actually roped together, so I'll attempt to do them all as a cluster. I'll first mention item D, David, the Board of Education Atlas. So this is a document that our board has been referencing now for close to a year, and it's intended to be a common source of reference material for the district or for the Board of Education. And there's a section in there called fiscal stewardship. And as you guys were reviewing that board atlas, if you have any questions about any of the other content that you see, you know, shout out, we can talk through any of that. But what I wanted to do is actually zero in specifically on the fiscal stewardship section and walk through some materials, because contained in those materials are the topics of CapEx, plan funding, and peer districts. So you have been given the May version of the atlas. But what I'm going to give you is a look at the early WIP for the June version, and just specifically the fiscal stewardship section. And I'm going to walk through some of that content, and the handout should allow you to follow along. And Bob is already in possession. So as I talk through some of this stuff, I welcome you to chime in with questions, comments, opinions, and so forth. There's even some specific asks that I'm requesting of this group, which I'll highlight in a second. So starting on page 2. Page 2 and 3 isn't currently in the May version, but it is in this June version that the Board of Education is going to get shortly. And though there's been this fiscal stewardship section of Board Atlas again for the past year, it's gone straight to content, but what I drafted here on page 2 and 3 is a bit of a preamble. It's more of a philosophical statement. Some of this may seem obvious, but it's not always obvious, I think, to whether it's new board members or administration members or members of the public and so forth that might see this. So I was interested in having a big picture statement to kind of anchor the specific content that follows here. On page 2, I try to address what constitutes good fiscal stewardship for a district. And I've got a why and what set of bullets here. This is my first pass of it. I'm really interested in CFC input by tomorrow. You can email me some input by tomorrow if you have any thoughts. And this is not intended to be long or complicated, but it's high level statements. And also TA is called out here by name, because I'm especially interested in anything that you might have to add. On these why it matters, why does fiscal stewardship matter? Again, at the risk of belaboring the obvious for an august group such as this, I still want to talk through a couple of things. And these are things I believed since I was first getting involved in public education back in 2011. Obviously, our mission of equitable and excellent education, we can't do it unless we have stable and sufficient resources. But whatever that initiative is, whether that's addressing the opportunity gap, having safe and accessible infrastructure, and so forth. The second bullet there is obviously we need resources to compete with the brightest faculty, staff, and administrators. And as you know, labor represents 75% of our operating expense. Thirdly, we have to earn and maintain the trust of local taxpayers, particularly in light of our unique situation in Oak Park and in Illinois, where we have this inordinate dependency on local property taxes for funding. But what it takes, strong commitment by the board and administration, and then we need enough structure, systems, and policies that can remain constant and enforced through whatever changes might happen with board members, administrators, and so forth. And then obviously we all hope for the application of transparency and best practices. So page 2 is kind of a mission statement, so to speak, for fiscal stewardship. Let me go to page 3. At an extremely high level, what I've enumerated here in the left and right columns are what are the basic structural requirements for good fiscal stewardship and what are some best practices. This is not meant to be exhaustive. I would label these lists as should include but are not limited to. Again, here by tomorrow, if you've got any input, I welcome that. And the reason I'm saying tomorrow is because I try to update this atlas in time for regular board meetings. And if I get it done tomorrow, it can be in the hands of our board colleagues by the Thursday night meeting. You know, one thing I'll highlight here under structural requirements, item 3, a standing community financial advisory oversight committee. And I consider this as a basic must-have for any school district. And I know historically for B200, it's been on and off and it's taken different forms and so forth. But I've highlighted here a couple of important bullets. One is this is a board committee, not an administration committee, which means this committee works for the board. I mean, it works in partnership and in collaboration with the administration, but it really works for the board. And there's two sides to that coin. One is the board is hungry for the wisdom of CFC. They really take seriously and are always asking, whichever one of us is on the rep here, what did CFC say about that? The other side of the coin, of course, is that the CFC can be a mechanism for accountability for the board itself. You'll see a third bullet here referencing 4 to 6 times per year meets. Historically, recent history has only been 4 times a year. I'd be interested in engaging this committee up to 6 times a year if the members are so willing. The last bullet, the analogy that I would use, I would credit Bob Spatz for this actually. This committee is like the Congressional Budget Office for our Board of Education. That's one way to think of or a context to think of this committee. So again, not meant to be exhaustive here. I'm going to pause and see if anyone has any comments, questions, or immediate thoughts.
Just more clarity thing. FAC and CFC are synonymous. Am I correct on that? In which case, one or the other should change.
You know, that's so fun. That's a thank you for that catch. That's just a typo on my part.
I'd say that the maybe the connection between academic achievement and, you know, fiscal, whatever you want to call it, efficiency or just resource allocation, maybe could be highlighted a bit more.
Would you do that on page 2 or somewhere on page 3 for both?
For me, it would be under why it matters.
I was just gonna say, it's, I like it, it's important, right? And the third, why it matters is, your third point, where it really drives the, good balance between wanting to have equitable and excellent education and also being fiscally, responsible and understanding that there are limited, resources that we also need to do it. So I think that would hit very well with the taxpayers.
Okay, so if you move on through this section, pages 4, 5, 6. Is language we have already read because it's right there in the menu. 7 and 8, you may recall in March, we had at that time and had been having a conversation about financial dashboard. And those prior conversations centered a lot around peer districts and then some benchmark data against those peer districts. But I actually think it was Kathleen who suggested, hey, let's make sure we also have the basic pie charts that show what do we use revenue for, what are the sources of revenue and so forth. So those have been added in here. And I think when we talk in a minute about it's time to stand up the dashboard alongside the P2 dashboard. Those pie charts plus the benchmarking metrics are, I think, what would constitute the minimum viable product for the dashboard. So after pie charts on slide 9, slide 10 is something that's been in the atlas for some time. This is that snapshot of the funds balance and then the fund balance, operating fund balance as a percentage of the total budget. So that's fairly straightforward. Slide 11 is also been around for a while. Slide 12, you've seen that before. That's what we discussed in March, the upside down funnel. I guess funnel wouldn't be just that, but upside down triangle showing how we arrive at peer districts. Starting on 13, 14, 15. In March, you saw an early look of this. This has been cleaned up a little bit. But these are what I consider some of the most elemental benchmarks to look at once you've established the peer districts. OpEx per pupil salary and benefits, and then what does our growth rate look like over the last 5 years. Two things to highlight. One is we have our 9 comparisons, but they don't all get their data uploaded to the state in the same timely way. And so therefore, these bar charts just show through fiscal year 2023. And Tony, can you remind me, I think we're just one district away from the 2024 data?
Yeah, it's the tool we use in Forecast 5 as of May. There was one district that still their AFR data was not uploaded yet. So in order to pull the details out to update this for fiscal 24, we can get that done as soon as the final district gets uploaded.
Yeah, I think it was down on number 1. Okay, and then the other thing is on slide 15, I credit Tony with having the idea to do the breakout for both salary and benefits. That's a good next level of detail there that is valuable to have. Okay, so the pies and the bars are what will go into our MVP of a financial dashboard. Does anybody have any comments, questions about this? Yes.
I've done this sort of thing with my students, so I did have some suggestions just for like how then you would use this. So again, if you know, you have these tier districts, not everybody looks like us. So if we have sort of, you know, similar demographics of students, then I would say, then you could take how much, you know, each district is spending, but then how is that coming out with student achievement? I mean, I think we want to keep, that would be my suggestion, is to keep making the connection, because it, I mean, it is just a number, it doesn't really mean anything until you're sort of then what, to what end.
That's a great point. The way I would describe this is we're in a crawl, walk, run situation, because this district has sometimes referenced peer benchmarks. Sometimes in doing so, maybe it wasn't always that clear or that public as to what districts and what was the methodology for that and so forth. So if you think about this work here, whether it's in the sense of getting more impact out of CSC or establishing just some baseline information that every board member can reference when they're making decisions and looking at issues. You know, first we're starting from the ground up here. So the first thing was, who even are our peers?
Yeah.
And actually, as Greg will rightly point out, there are academic peers and then there's financial peers. So Bob, you can certainly chime in if you want to regarding slide 12, how we got to our peer group. So the first thing is even to establish who are the right peers. We have a rock solid methodology. Then the next thing is to say, all right, what are a handful of base starter benchmarks that we can capture and that could be relevant? So now, you know, we have that here. What do you do with it and what comes next? This is by no means, oh, got the answer and we're going forward. That's the reason I use the term MVP, minimum viable product, just to get something established. But there's a number of lenses to look at this information through. One of them might be, you know, in the context of CBA negotiations, for example. But I also think that that piece of tying out to academic performance is really good. And we had brought in, or I think Tony, you had even about a year ago generated a handful of comparisons between financial data and academic performance. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd have to dig through to find, but it's some charts that Forecast 5 puts together that compares the average spend per pupil with testing scores at various, whether it's math or science or literacy. And I always kind of look at it as the tells you, are you getting the most without spending the most? And we charted right in the quadrant we wanted to, where we're spending below average compared to our peers or the peers that we had at the time, but then outperforming most of them as well, which was great to see.
Bob, do you have anything you want to say at this point?
Yeah, one of the things I remember Greg mentioning when you're thinking about academic peers is you can go down to the school level in a way that you can't on the financial side. So we have a lot more possible valid comparisons for peer high schools than we do for peer high school districts. And so at some point we're going to, you know, after the academic team decides who their you know, academic peers are, we're going to have to see what the intersection of that is, and is it large enough to do something where we do both, or do we need to make both a little bigger to do some comparison? But we didn't feel that we could even begin to guess at, it's outside of our scope to guess at who would be the peer academic high schools, the peer comparison for academic high schools. And the big thing is because unit districts have high schools, there are a lot of high schools that we just can't compare to on the financial side because unit districts are just too hard to compare to high school districts on finances. But from an academic side, there are very few places that aren't doing 9 through 12 school, even unit districts. So, that makes the academic universe larger.
Okay, so the other thing I think is great about your question is, where do we go from here can take a few different directions. And one of the things I was hoping for is that the CSC can recommend additional benchmarks and metrics. And so that's part of kind of a little transformation of this committee, I think. Instead of lots of dog and pony to get head nods, it's okay for CSC members to advocate for ways to analyze data, additional information and perspective and so forth. I think that adding the academic cut or adding back the academic cut, because Tony did bring forth one first attempt at it, is a great example of kind of okay, what comes next. And I also, wanted to say that CSC can nominate, any other particular benchmark that they might find interesting or useful. About a year ago also, when we had a first conversation about this, Steve Miller had actually generated some example charts and so forth. So I know there's a lot of good ideas and thinking here. We can build on this for sure. Okay. Let's now look at the next section, use of debt. What about our fiscal policies, which you actually put in this fiscal stewardship section? We actually pulled up highlights of the district's formal fiscal policies. What doesn't exist right now, well, it exists only in kind of limited ways, is guidelines around use of debt. So what this is here, starting on slide 17, is a first draft of some guidelines and Tony's patented 7-step framework. I give all the credit to Tony here on this because through his experience he was able to surface what are some best practices for this. And so just walking through slide 18, I'm not going to read up every bullet, but kind of for the first time we're putting it on paper again, for the benefit and implementation by the board, kind of a pilot's checklist, so to speak, as we think about using debt. And part of the reason to document this and establish a foundation for it is to make sure that when situations, issues, opportunities, needs come up, we're not inventing from whole cloth, from scratch, every time these issues have to be processed and decided upon by the board. I would say, this is also something, the debt issuance guidelines, where we welcome CSC input. We realize you're not going to process it this second. Input here, I don't need by tomorrow, but over time, or by the time we meet again, if you have additional thoughts on bullets or refinements, we're gonna certainly welcome that. That's a good example of maximizing the brain power of this. I'm going to point you to slide 19. This is a brilliant table that Tony assembled. And Tony, would you like to walk us through this table?
Sure. What this does is, if our first step is we have to figure out why would we need to issue debt, and then two, determine, okay, it's let's say a project that requires debt that we don't have the fund balance for. I think the next step would be determine the appropriate type of debt to issue. This walks through just the general requirements, whether it's building bonds or working cash, debt certificates and lease certificates. It talks through limits of payback term. Is there a referendum requirement to it? Does there need to be a public hearing? Is it subject to the statutory debt limits? And then just kind of helps the board guide through how do we then issue the debt and what type to issue. We try to bring it back to you could, depending on your limit, you could buy a car and put it on your credit card if you had enough money, but it may not be the right type of debt to use to purchase an automobile. So this just talks about the different tools and what are the requirements of using those.
Is there anything you want to say about slide 20?
Yep, sorry, just haven't turned the page yet. Following that, then determine the amount of debt to issue, look at our limits, consider the impact on our taxpayers, and then if similar to what was done in project 2, find out, is there capital reserves that can offset some of the costs? From there, look at the strategies to implement the debt, make sure that we have a balanced debt portfolio, review our outstanding debt and refinancing opportunities, monitor our credit ratings to make sure that we're not issuing debt at a rate that causes significant drops in the rating. And then it also gives some, a lot of these steps, I tried to go back to our conversation in the previous meeting. So in step 4, we talked about, the board shouldn't handcuff future boards, but also then take into the consideration that the board is kind of a continuous board that always serves the school district. It always has that intent to, continue the operations of the district. So one of the steps, for example, is the current board has to consider the impact on future borrowing ability and what that could do to future boards, depending on the length and the amount that's being issued. From there, when required, conduct a public review and increase transparency. And then finally, continue to review and adjust our debt policies to make sure that both we're following requirements post debt issuance, and that our strategies and the conditions have not changed. And if they have, and or if legal requirements have changed, that we're staying in compliance.
Well said, Tony. One thing I would do also is call your attention back on slide 19 to this menu of 7 different debt tools. Some of them a district like ours may never have to utilize. Some of them are useful, for example, for a district that might have financial difficulty and having to use debt for operating expenses. And unfortunately, that's not us. But you may recall from our March meeting, we had a conversation around preferred practices or guidelines as to how a district like ours can best fund major capital improvements, such as Project 1 and Project 2 and so forth. And as I was rereading the meeting minutes, apart from realizing I was talking too much, the kind of consensus of this group was, where possible and practical, it's the school building bonds, it's the sort of logical first choice. But again, we're not trying to preordain. But with that notion in mind, one thing I was really interested in is establishing a framework for how to think about the use of school building bonds for major capital projects, and that's what you'll then start to see on slide 21. And what I've done here is I've started out and this is very simplistic, very rudimentary, but I started out over a 30-year period the existing project 2 debt certificate commitment and the debt service costs of that. And then added a couple of columns to represent hypothetical additional debt issuances using school bonds. What would that look like as compared to the total operating levy? And then what does that total CapEx debt service cost look like as a percentage of our total tax levy? And the reason I wanted to do this is a few things and under a few assumptions. You know, first of all, from a financial standpoint, this district is coming out of a 20-year era of what I would call anomalous conditions. Those anomalous conditions include a very high fund balance, 60 years of deferred investment, and the carrying of zero debt. And I think, you know, even erroneously referencing that sometimes as a bragging right, which I don't think it is. So chances are the financial conditions of the district that we had in the last 20 years aren't going to happen again. So part of the purpose of this framework is to set up this board and future boards for how to think about our capital needs and our capital funding in the new normal, which is more typical, where we've got a fund balance that's between 25 and 50% of operating expenses. Also baked into this is that assumption that building bonds are the right and first mechanism. And the goal here is to create stability and predictability for resources. So it's not some, you know, massive pulling a rabbit out of a hat to get access to CapEx funding. We also want to be able to continuously maintain and modernize the infrastructure of this place because it is 150 years old. How many acres is this?
I don't know acres, I know the building is 1 million square feet.
That's okay, that was my next question. Acres and how many, and 1 million square feet, yeah, okay. So we know you've almost got a rotating challenge around this infrastructure. You know, there's gonna be needs for modernization, rehabilitation, and the enabling of access, which is a huge problem has been a huge problem for good portions of the building. Having this framework also, I think, helps to minimize the impact to taxpayers, because if we're doing this in sort of a smoother and more systematic way, there's less likely to be a need for a sudden spike, for example, in our tax levy due to address some kind of major infrastructure problem. And then also, kind of anchoring to that first choice of school building bonds is what helps ensure that the current and future generations who are users and beneficiaries of the new infrastructure are also primary payers of that infrastructure. Of course, that's what bonds help to do. So this is a rudimentary Excel model that then creates a visual on page 22. And what I would say about this is two things. Again, this is very rudimentary because what this does is that, you know, we are only doing 5-year forecasts, which makes sense because it's hard to have any reliable predictor for beyond 5 years. So what this does is this takes our current 5-year plan operating levy and then just applies the 2.5% growth rate out over the next 30 years just to create, for illustration purposes, the viewpoint out to 2054. And then what you see at the base level of the stacks is first the debt service costs of project 2, and because that's debt certificates, as you all know, those are paid for from operating funds. And then what also I've added to the stacks are 2 additional hypothetical building bonds, building bond issuances. And on the prior page on the Excel sheet, I can send you all this, but you can play with the numbers, term of debt, amount, interest rate and so forth. And it'll translate to what the stacks look like. And then the line, of course, is what is the total CapEx as a percentage of the operating budget? You'll recall, I was curious if anybody had any takes on that during the March meeting. And this is probably one area where our peer districts aren't gonna be necessarily that useful because everybody's situations can be so different when it comes to CapEx. Some people might have just had a big project or maybe retired a project. But I think it is still useful in any case to be able to model, and I'm a visual guy, so I like the visuals. Hypothetical CapEx debt as a percentage of the total levy, because then it gives you a sense of proportion. If we were to issue this debt, what does that represent on top of whatever the current tax bill is for folks? Obviously, when you get to having to run referendums and stuff like that, there's a lot of calculation that gets done on your EAV at that time. And it gets translated to how this might affect the tax bill on a typical $400,000 house and so forth. But again, this is to help conceptualize this idea of monitoring CapEx debt as a percentage of total tax levy. The other thing about the visualization is that it gives you kind of a sense of where the opportunities might exist for the smoothing of the use of CapEx debt. So for example, when Bob and I were at D97, there was a need for capital building bonds issuance to address some elementary school expansions. And it just so happened that the timing of that need coincided with the retirement of the bonds that were issued to build Brooks and Julian Middle School. So the benefit of that timing was that there was effectively a smoothing of the use of CapEx debt, such that the way the taxpayers experienced it was basically largely status quo, at least for that aspect. And again, this is advantageous in a number of ways. How the taxpayers experience it, but also the sustainability of access for a district to capital funds when they're needed. And that's part of the thinking there. The last thing I'll say about that is obviously, our first choice is building bonds, that requires running a referendum. And nobody should be afraid of running referendums, because if we build a strong foundation, a house of iron in terms of our fiscal stewardship, our best practices, our transparency, our use of benchmarking. If you have that foundation, that's what enables your case to the community for a new capital bond issuance, or any other type of request you might be asking of the community through a referendum. Obviously, economic conditions and the quality of that case, it's ultimately up to the taxpayers to decide. But we want to make sure that our district, coming out of its last 20 years of anomalous conditions, is as strong and well managed as it can be going forward for both this era we're in right now and future eras, future administrators, future board members. So I'll pause there, and I welcome any comments or questions regarding this framework. Fell asleep. I apologize for that. Well, actually, you're welcome for getting me some good rest. But I realized a lot to digest, process at this moment. Thoughts come up. You can send me an email, or we can be prepared to talk further next meeting.
Right, just something quickly for the whole group. Graham referenced the 2017 capital referendum, utilizing when the middle school bonds were going to be done. But in fact, that dates back 20 years. The middle school bonds were sold to replace bonds that had been sold in the 70s to expand the schools during the tail end of the baby boom. So that was, that expiration being used so that, in fact, if I remember right from 99, because EAVs were going up, the bond tax rate actually went down with the passage of referendum because enough debt was being retired. Like if you have a car loan that's being done, sometimes you can buy a new car for less than you were paying for your old car. Timing, long-term timing is very important. And I think that that's one thing, as Graham referenced, the anomalous time for District 200 for whatever reasons, some of which I'm sure were good, some of which I'm sure were not. They let all their debt expire, and therefore anything was going to be seen as, and not just seen, but realistically be increases to taxes.
It's a good point, Bob. I'd forgotten that the middle school bonds themselves had been a continuation of prior bond issuance.
Graham, can you give just a little bit of a high level overview of the atlas as a sort of a living, reading document? I don't recall it coming before us before, so I'd like to understand a little bit of the background of sort of the purpose of it. I like it as a way to codify a lot of these things, but I'd like to hear a little more about how it functions in practice with the board
Sure.
on an ongoing basis. Things.
Yeah, and you know, codification may be too strong of a word because it's not an official policy document or something like that. What happened was, I got elected in 2023, and I had come on from, the prior D97 experience, kind of used to certain data and reference information always being at fingertips. And I was feeling like, boy, a lot of core information that board members should know cold, like what are the demographics of our students, for example. It was kind of floating out in space, or maybe if I pull it up in board docs or something, I can find it. So I wanted to put in one place the kind of basic information about the district that was, so it could be readily accessible. As long as I'm making that for myself, I'm going to give it to the rest of the board. So the reason it's a living, breathing document is I generally update it every month if something new and interesting comes up. So like Tony will, show us the budget. So I'll grab the budget data. The demographic information on students comes out in the fall enrollment report. I do my own slicing and dicing of that. That's the reason it shows up the way it does using conditional formatting. And then I'm hyper interested also in our teaching staff demographics. So I'll pull from that report. So that's kind of the background of it.
Thanks.
Well, I have a question about 97, and the bond issuances and things like that. How's their budget? Were they in deficit spending, or were they making enough to make it year by year? Or?
So since I've been talking too much, Bob, do you want to answer that?
Sure. And the 2017, the most recent referendum and bond issue, Graham and I convinced some hesitant people that the only transparent way to do it with the community was to run an operating referendum at the same time as a capital referendum. So there were actually two questions on the ballot because we were running a slight deficit and it was projected to get worse. And so we needed to address both the operating deficit and the capital needs. In 99, I believe they were running a small surplus at that point, but they were projected to go into deficit by like 2002, 2003. So it wasn't a strong surplus situation at all, but I do believe it was still a surplus in 99 when the middle school bond referendum was run. And just for transparency and completeness, while it's often referred to as the middle school referendum, about 25% of the money went into improvements to the 8 elementary schools as well.
Okay. Okay. As the district ID, we were running a deficit and, they're figuring something out now as far as, using the R word. But here, there's money in the bank and a surplus every year. Right?
I think where a lot of this will go is, when you think in this time next year, there really won't be, there will be money in the bank, we're not going to go bankrupt, but we'll have money in the bank to the tune of what most school districts carry, about 30%. The surpluses at that point, with having not taken the maximum levy for so many years, are going to start to really smooth out a little bit in our projections. If you look, like, we're not building, in the latest round of projections, we're not building, back towards the 50%, but we're staying in that 30% range to where operationally we'd be okay. But looking at capital improvements, that's where it would then become difficult to self-fund that.
Okay, so just hypothetically, before we started project number one, we were running at a surplus and we had money in the bank. Now I understand everything's going towards construction and things like that. And the surplus will go away because of operating expenses and, we're borrowing money and stuff. But in theory, we have a surplus to cover those expenses. Kind of, right? I mean, the debt service is helping us, but there is still money in the surplus. We're paying stuff off of it, but we have it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But again, if you look at our surpluses as we project out.
Right.
They're not large surpluses.
They're not large, they're
Yeah.
small. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay.
Right, and also, as I understand it, a chunk of the operating funds have been committed to paying back the debt service.
Right.
Or the debt certificates, is that the proper term?
Yes.
Right, and so, you just need to figure out how to categorize those, but at some level, because there was that operating surplus, you could sell debt certificates instead of building bonds. But eventually you won't have that operating surplus forever. I can't picture. Not the way the state funding formula is set up, and between the state funding formula and tax caps, there's almost no way for District 200 to continue long-term without some sort of referendum unless there's significantly falling enrollment.
Yeah, I mean, that, in 2023, the decision was made, after having, had this inordinately large fund balance for a long time, close to $100 million, the decision was, to take 45 million of that and put it toward CapEx, which suddenly, well, as of fiscal year 2023, you will have a normalized, operating funds balance. And normalized means you're maintaining between 25 and 50% of your annualized expenses. And in that sense, you don't really have excess money. I mean, you're right where a district should be in terms of enough to pay the bills and not really find themselves in a emergency situation, but at the same time, you're not where you were before, which is having like way more money than a district should have in operating funds. So we're kind of in this new normal going forward.
I think what makes it unique to the district, not unique to the state, or other districts in the state too, but as we've chosen to utilize the larger fund balances for construction, and then bring our policies down, we're seeing both the reduction of the fund balances impact the fund balance to operating expense ratio, but then also over the years, expenses have continued to creep up. So we're seeing the expense side grow while the fund balances come down, and that's gonna hit that, that ratio really from both ends.
No, thanks.
See if anybody else has got thoughts like that. That doesn't look like it.
I'm done.
No, you're just. Okay, so that was capital plan funding, your districts and the analysts. Okay, next up is item E, the proposed CFC meeting dates for the 2025-2026 school year. And then it's 12 dates, out here, the potential dates, so we're looking to, we used to meet quarterly. Graham's hoping to meet semi-monthly,
Hoping,
every other month, bi-monthly, whatever.
Oh, there's 12 dates. We're not meeting every month.
No,
No.
There's
That's
$100 million on the street. We're not meeting every month.
I was
Over
hoping
$100 million.
I was hoping for 4 to 6, which is more than.
I think you need to be updated every month on what's going on. Before something happens. If we meet every quarter, anything can happen within that 3 months. We get here, they're like, oh, by the way, $30 million just kind of went out the window.
that's why Graham suggested the 6 times a year instead of the 4.
I just go 12.
So this is,
Get us some sandwiches.
you official members,
That's special Decide.
4 to 1.
Yeah, it sounds like.
4
Be ready
to
for school
1 against.
board.
Yeah, Cal wants all 12.
Yeah.
Graham, do you remember how often the District 97 committee met? I think we started out monthly and then drifted to later. What was it when you were on it?
We met monthly.
Okay.
Now I think it's quarterly, maybe, if lucky.
But also it was like during the referendum, so I think.
Oh, yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, now it's like quarterly, I think, maybe. It really depends. I don't know what's going on there. I couldn't even tell you who the CFO is. I think it's an interim person right now.
I think 6 is reasonable, but I don't know necessarily that we want it to be every other month. I think it needs to align with the key board votes and decisions related to the budget, the levy, and those sorts of things, and then kind of backing up from the board's calendar into our calendar.
Yeah. Maybe there's a month where sometimes it's back to back.
Right.
Months. We did that before when we were looking at
Mhm.
project 2, we were discussing all that
We've
stuff.
definitely been more than 4 times a year
Yeah,
that year.
Once every month for like 4 months.
So let's keep in mind that you only have August 12th, my serve, so you don't have to take select 5 weeks.
Another possibility, just to, I don't know if it will confuse things or help things, there's always the possibility of something like 8 times a month where you take,
8 times
Eight times a month.
sorry, 8 times a year, sorry.
Consider the new members.
Eight times a year where you take certain months off that are going to be, take one off in the summer, one off around the holidays, one off around spring break, one off in the fall or something. And so that you're not going all the way to a monthly cadence, but again, to the point of, do you have enough meetings close enough together that if the board wants input before a major decision, and the major decisions usually are budget adoption in September, levy adoption in December, and preliminary budget stuff in the spring.
Yeah, so Steve, I'm okay with 6 too. I don't know if based off excluding the 12, because as Lisa said, we already have the 12 marked off, because that's the budget. That's basically the budget meeting. I don't know if I'm geared to like picking which of these dates we want to choose, but more of like, these are the options. We can potentially have a meeting on those dates. And then,
One other thing as we talk about the number of meetings, to keep in mind is, as this is a board committee, we'd have to ensure that, the dates we select, we at least can project we'll have enough people here for a quorum.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we have meetings scheduled, but people aren't able to make them in sequence, then we would just have to leave at that point.
That makes a better argument for dinner.
I would definitely suggest that we choose the dates set the dates for the year with maybe a couple of optional dates that could be added as needed, so maybe we pick 6 and choose 2 that could be backup dates as needed around those key decisions. But I personally would strongly prefer to have the dates set as opposed to finding them out as we go along.
Okay.
We could take the last one on. It's not during the school year unless there's something like an action that would be.
Oh, the June 16th of 2026.
And March 17th is St. Patrick's Day.
Priorities.
We got it.
Yeah, we gotta recognize religious holidays.
Okay. I actually had a question mark next to the 17th because I was thinking that's spring break time. I don't usually spring break falls in March.
Yeah, no,
I think ours like
It's a week after that.
Last week in March.
last week in March, this next school. year.
Okay, you guys share the same 90 to 97. I feel like
Almost always do.
okay. I don't know. I feel like one year they were different.
Well, would we need is there a reason for a December meeting? Because there's always too much happening in December. So,
December's usually the levy. Or you already decide levy before the 9th.
Well, you moved that up a month this year.
Yeah, we, this last year, and it's something that, well, we haven't fully, being heavy in budget season right now. It's kind of the next step, but, I would anticipate, again, bringing the levy for a final vote at, early December to allow for more time to have it be submitted and gives us a little bit of a safety net. So the November meeting, I think, would be one we definitely need to keep, because we'd be in between the tentative levy and the final levy.
I might even go October, Tony, because if we do a levy adoption in early December, then when you kind of work back through that timeline of truth and taxation and all of that, we may be bringing that tentative levy to the board in early November to where we would want CFC to have their eyes on it in October.
Yeah, great point.
Right,
And
it's
just-
almost oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and just for a couple other dates that might follow along kind of how we've done it the last couple years. Typically January, we would have our auditors come in and review financial results from the year before. So that might be a good date to keep. And then June is typically where we do our preliminary budget discussion like we're doing tonight. So again, that allows CFC to see it first before the board starts reviewing it in August.
What I was gonna say was it sounding like that you could almost inverse take quarters off. March is close to spring break. June is a light time as long as you have a meeting in July to look at the preliminary budget. September, sort of the same thing. The budget has to be passed by the end of September. You can't be giving input at that point. And then December is both close to the holidays and they have the levy adopted before a CFC meeting could happen in December anyway. So maybe we start with those 8 and then maybe mark a couple as tentative or something. But it certainly seems like the December, March, June, and the usual 4 quarters are the ones to knock out right off the bat.
I actually would advocate for keeping the June meeting.
Instead of July.
Yeah, instead of July, because it gives us more time to, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, we've got really the first blush at the budget, where things are starting to fall into place. But then as the windows tighten up over those 2 months, then as we come back in August, we've got a much clearer picture as we do our tentative budget.
I'm fine with that.
That's August, well, that's right, it's calendar, August 12th. October 14th. These are the mature months so far. January 20th for sure, and then June 2026 for sure. We've had, that's 4 right now. We said,
I think for sure we said no July, December, or March meetings.
yeah, so yes, across December and then March off.
And what about May? It's such a crazy. Like, is there anything happening in May? Because I assume it could be all right not to have a meeting
You're right about crazy.
from a cadence perspective.
Well, you have to answer the other part of that question, but May is usually very packed and hard to predict.
Yeah, I would recommend, no May meeting, the April meeting, I think gives us an opportunity, we're, to come in, post any, I don't know if there's seats up for the board this upcoming election.
No.
Okay, so we won't be impacted by that. Yeah, and so I would say if we're taking March off and May off, then we'd want to keep the April meeting.
And then maybe January, February is one or the other, depending on timing of the audits or other things going on.
Well, yeah.
They probably don't need both.
Okay,
Yeah, I would say January, just because we wouldn't wanna. The audit would be complete and submitted, but it's a faster turnaround than to get the audit results in.
August, October, November. January, April, June. I think that's what I.
yep, yeah. All right. That's not good for everybody. Yeah, okay,
So August, October, November, January, April, June.
January, yep,
Yes.
Okay.
next up is item F, preliminary budget.
Sure, so as I just had alluded to, we have now had budget requests from different departments come in. We are sorting through what where everybody's requests have been, what are any known changes from the last round of projections. And I will turn it over to Brian to kind of walk us through it all.
All right, thanks, Tony. So one of the items that we were just talking about, actually, that's outlined in the CFC's charge is to review and provide input on the annual budget. So tonight is our first look at what the budget is looking like for fiscal year 26. And looking at our timeline, this is the first of 3 public presentations involving the budget. So after we gather CFC's feedback tonight, the board will perform its initial review in early August, like I was saying. And then in September, we'll hold a public hearing and the final version of the budget gets adopted. So budget is a 9 to 10 month cycle in total, but a lot of the formal discussion and review in public happens kind of within this 2 to 3 month chunk that we've just kicked off now. The budget process resembles a zero-based budgeting method, which means each year we start at 0 and build our way up by providing a rationale for all the budget dollars that have been requested. So for example, if you take salaries and benefits, those get budgeted by individual staff member. When we talk about the capital budget, that gets built using our project bid awards and draw schedules that come from our construction manager and architects. And then all the other spending areas are based on itemized requests that get put together from the various district budget managers. Revenues, on the other hand, primarily come from the annual tax levy, but there are other sources of revenue that are dependent on numerous other factors such as enrollment or economic conditions, or if we're talking about grants, those can be highly dependent on the state's budget. Now, as we move into more specifics regarding the fiscal year 26 budget, starting with revenues, again, like I was saying, property tax revenues driven by the tax levy, which was approved by the board last December. And that was the most recent levy passed was for a 2.5% increase plus new property. So that will serve as the basis for the largest chunk of our revenues next year. That levy was less than the maximum 3.4% permitted under PTEL. So the property tax revenue budget is pretty much set in stone at this point, other than, you know, the amount of refunds potentially issued by the county each year. The corporate personal property replacement taxes are a completely different story. And as you can see in the chart on this slide, they've really been a roller coaster ride over the last 6 or 7 years. We had revenues spike at the tail end of the pandemic in 2022, 2023. But since, those have come, you know, tumbling back down over the last 3 years. While that decline was always expected, the rate at which it's decreased has been sharper than planned, and our revenue has been less than budgeted in each of the last 2 years. Typically, the Department of Revenue puts out an estimate sometime in late July or early August for what the upcoming year's revenues may look like. Again, they are estimating, so that is not a solid number by any means. But it does seem likely that the funding for this revenue source will eventually settle back in this $1.5 to $2 million range that we were seeing before the pandemic. So our budget for fiscal year 26 has built in another decrease of actually 17% for next year, as shown by the green bar there at the end of the chart. Interest rates on investments continue to be favorable as we close out the year. Although the amount of funds that we'll have available for investing next year will be less, we're still expecting to generate about $3.8 million of interest revenue. And that's inclusive of $1 million that will come from the invested debt certificate proceeds. State revenues will receive a temporary boost from a $3.5 million grant that was secured by the Imagine Foundation as part of their $12.5 million funding commitment for Project 2. It was about this time last year when that grant award became official. So we initially thought we might receive some of those funds in fiscal year 25. However, the money was just recently made available by the governor's office. About a week or two ago, we just got notification or communication from our grant manager as to, you know, with information to start filling out grant application documents and things of that nature. So we do feel more comfortable that some of that money will start flowing in next year. We've budgeted $2.5 million of revenue in fiscal year 26, with the assumption that with construction already ongoing, we will be able to turn around some of those reimbursements pretty quickly. And then another $1 million will be budgeted in the following year. And then
Brian,
lastly,
just where in the budget is the Imagine dollars? Is that just other local?
yes, those are lumped into the other local sources. They show up in the non-operating funds. So the money gets deposited right into our capital projects fund,
Okay.
and then it gets used to fund those capital expenditures. And then just to hit the last bullet point on this slide, we're now about 9 months removed from the conclusion of the pandemic-related ESSER grants. So that will result in a reduction of about 8% in federal grant revenue for next year. Otherwise, our federal grant money typically remains fairly flat from year to year. Here we have a summary of the revenue budget by category. Total revenue budgeted for fiscal year 26 is $108 million. And then the column farthest to the right indicates that is about a 3% increase from where we believe revenues will finish for fiscal year 25. Our fiscal year 25 revenues are trending under budget, particularly in other local sources because of those falling CPPRT revenues I mentioned. And then also in the other state sources because of that 1-year delay in the capital grant. So after recalibrating for those items, the total revenue budget wound up being nearly identical to the budget in fiscal year 25, as is called out by the figures in the blue box there. Then there's a couple pie charts on slide 7 that present a side-by-side comparison of the district's budgeted revenues by source for next year versus this year. And as we've been saying multiple times tonight, the district's high reliance on property taxes for its funding really makes these charts almost identical from year to year. They rarely change more than 1 to 2 percentage points between categories. And you can see that's the case again this year. So then I'll just pause here for a moment to see if there are any questions on the revenue area of the budget.
That's a question, Brian. Why was the 3.5 from the state divided out 2 fiscal years? Because I thought that was all related to the geothermal. So wouldn't it all just be taken care of this year? That your expenses should be paid? Or is
Say
it
that
related to
one.
something else? The 3.5.
Say that one more time.
The
Uh-huh.
3.5 grant from the state, why is it divided out into 2 fiscal years?
Oh,
I thought that was tied to the geothermal project.
No, that's going to be tied to Project 2, because it is making up a portion of the 12.5 million that's coming from Imagine Foundation.
Okay. I also thought I originally saw the 12.5 that was separate from the 3.5 that we were getting from the state originally, like years ago. They talked about 10 and then they did 12.5. And I thought this grant in the state was completely separate. I don't know.
Yeah, so the 3.5 is definitely part of the Imagine 12.5. Okay, and maybe in early discussions, may have been talked about in different ways, but it's definitely part of it. They took the lead in pursuing that, and we're really thankful for that. To clarify P2 versus geothermal and all that, your first question, the geothermal project is actually broken up to 2 different vendors, really, right? We have the well field, which is run by Verigy, and we have all the stuff that's inside the mechanicals for all of it, which are led by Field Main, and the 3.5, that portion is going to go towards the part of the project that's inside the P2 footprint, right? If you want to think of it that way, the Field Main footprint. So that's it.
Okay.
And when that is up and running, we're several months away. Even though the well field is for all purposes is done right now, we're months away from the inside mechanicals being hooked up.
Yeah.
The other thing is with those state grants, we've had a couple other grants of similar nature that have gone through the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Obviously much smaller in value, but typically they like to withhold payout on the final portion of the money until the project is complete or very close to completion. So that's the other reason for kind of holding some back for the second fiscal year in terms of a revenue projection.
Any other questions on revenues? All right, Brian, no other questions in here, so you can continue.
All right, so then moving into expenditures and starting with personnel costs, the district has one contract that is in the process of being negotiated. That is for our classified personnel, but all remaining salaries have been finalized, and overall salaries are currently budgeted to increase 4%. As part of the first payroll of the school year, which happens second half of August, the business office does a reconciliation to to ensure that any turnover or position vacancies have been accounted for properly in the budget. Historically, that reconciliation has produced a slight decrease in salaries compared to the first draft of the budget. So that is one area where we could potentially find some additional savings when all is said and done with the final budget draft. Employee benefits, and in particular health insurance, are one of the fastest growing expenses in the district's budget. And I think that is fairly common nationwide. Insurance premiums for District 200 are set on a calendar year basis. So our budget contains 6 months of known expenses and then 6 months of expenses that are based on an estimated rate increase. So some of you may remember last December, the committee agreed to modify the assumption for health insurance increases from 7% to 8% based on some of the claims experience we had been having internally. So for now, that is the same rate that is being used for the January to June timeframe within the budget. A little bit later this month, we'll be meeting with our insurance consultants to kind of kick off discussions for our 2026 insurance renewal. So this is an area that is certainly subject to change over the next couple months as well. The equipment budget is being reduced by over $500,000 next year. Last year, we had asked for a pretty substantial increase within the equipment area because we had several needs that all kind of came due in the same year. Some of those were the replacement of driver's ed vehicles, upgrades to our security camera system, and then the replacement of various forms of technology equipment, including our servers. As part of that request last year, we assured the board that the equipment budget would be reduced the following year. So this budget is making good on that commitment. Construction, of course, continues to be a main storyline for fiscal year 26. We have over $62 million, or nearly 40% of the total budget that is going towards capital expenditures. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a couple slides. The district will also have $3 million of obligations due for principal and interest on the debt certificates. If you remember when those were issued, we structured them in a way that annual payment on the debt certificates would be roughly 3.3 or 3.4 million every year. So we are looking at 3.2 million for fiscal year 26. The other big storyline with this year's budget is special education expenses. There are a number of areas in the purchase services and other objects expense categories that are working against us a little bit from a cost perspective. The largest of those areas is tuition, because we're currently estimating that the number of students placed in private school facilities will increase from 46 to 55. And that's at an average cost of about $80,000 per student. We also expect that residential school student placements will go up by 2 students, and those run about $200,000 per student. With more outplacement also comes additional costs for transportation of services for those students. And then we're also seeing a need for some additional contractual services required to support our current population of students with IEPs. So these are things like one-to-one nursing aides and speech therapy services. If you take all of these items combined within the special education realm here, it currently amounts to a total budget impact of $1.6 million. Now, with that being said, there are student evaluations and placements still in progress over the course of the summer. The 55 student number is an estimate still at this point. There are students that are kind of being evaluated that could potentially end up being outplaced or may not be outplaced. So that number is kind of still in flux. So these counts are our best estimate at this point in time. I am in the midst of working with our special education department to get a better handle on these costs, not just for next year, but also long-term. Just because a student is placed at an outside school for 1 year does not necessarily mean they will be there for 4 years. Sometimes they are there for a year and return to OPRF. Sometimes they started OPRF and then get outplaced. So trying to gather some additional information on these particular students to help us assess the total impact on our 5-year financial projection will be a major goal here over the next 2 months.
I had a
Can I ask
question
a
about,
Question, oh, go ahead.
what percent of this, if any, can be expected to be reimbursed by the state or the Fed? I assume it's non-zero, and I know it's well less than 100, but I just wasn't sure if you're projecting that as well.
Yeah, good question. A portion of that money does come back to us in the form of state and or federal revenue. The federal revenue number, which covers the room and board portion of outplaced student tuition, tends to be a little bit more reliable in the sense that it's been fairly close to 85 to 90% of expenses reimbursed annually. Obviously, we're seeing that revenue the year after we incur the expenses, but that is built into the long-range projection.
Okay.
The state revenue is a little bit more tricky because it comes down to really how the state budgets for those categorical grants. And if next year they are planning to hold those categorical grant revenue allocations flat. So as school district expenses are increasing, we're getting a smaller percentage reimbursed to us.
Yep.
And then Kathleen, I believe you were going to ask a question.
Same question.
Okay. All right, so then here's another side-by-side chart comparison, this time for expenditures between next year's budget and this year's budget. As noted before, the budget for construction has once again consumed more of the overall pie, taking away a little bit from many of the other areas. Although the 2 years are not drastically different, the breakdown by category is a little unusual because the education industry typically sees 50 to 60% of expenses come from salaries and benefits. Next year, that chart on the left, you can see those areas will make up just 44% of District 200's costs. All right, and then slide 11 is the numerical summary for expenditures. The section circled in blue shows that the budget for operating expenditures is increasing 5% from the previous year's budget. For perspective, that $1.6 million of special ed expenditures I referenced earlier, that accounts for about 1.8% of that increase. It's also worth reiterating that the budget will continue to evolve over the next 3 months. During that time, we'll learn not only how exactly we fared in fiscal year 25, but we'll be able to solidify some of these other assumptions on things like special education outplacements, CPPRT revenue, things of that sort. And then that will also help us identify areas where other savings or efficiencies can be gained. Any questions on the expense side of the budget?
I just have one question about the benefits. So it looks like the increase in benefit costs last year was 9.3%, but the assumption is 8%. But is there any thought of changing the assumption for next year based on the 9% increase this year?
So the 9% is taking into account all benefits, not just health insurance. So there are some pension costs built in there as well. Other employee benefits such as 403B contributions, things of that nature all roll in. One reason why we're seeing 9% is as opposed to the 8 is that whole difference in the calendar year versus fiscal year for the health insurance year. In 2025, we had a insurance renewal of over, I believe it was 9.2% that rates went up. So we were kind of dealing with that increase in addition to the estimated 8% increase for this year that is inflating that percentage a little bit more than our typical 8% assumption we use for health insurance.
What's the major reason for the increase in the purchase services and the supplies? The 6 and 7%, is that related to the special education support services or something else?
In purchase services, I would say yes, that there is a substantial chunk of special education that falls within there. In supplies, that one of the largest, I would say, increases we are seeing in that category has to do with electricity. And there was, trying to think how to explain this the best way. So when we get our electric bills, there is a breakdown between not just our actual usage, but also the cost of essentially buying that electricity and transmitting it to the building. Every year, that transmission cost is bid out and changes outside of anything the district can control. And that cost for next year has increased exponentially. And that is not just a District 200 thing. That is, for providers of electricity in the entire area. So our electricity budget is actually going up about $225,000 next year and is causing a large portion of the 7% increase there. Anything else on expenses? Okay.
Just one thing I'll jump in and note too, you'll see some of it is related to timing of when payments come due for project 2 in the construction budget. So when you see some of the initial projections compared to now what we are budgeting for, you'll see there's almost a direct correlation to the shortage of expenses paid versus what was originally budgeted for. It's just due for the timing of the bills coming in at the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah, great point. When we were doing the budget last year, we were really just kicking off almost project 2 to where when you're estimating draw schedules and payments for a 2 to 2.5 year project, a lot was still highly tentative at that point. So now we'll see the flip side of it, of any variances that occurred on the construction side in fiscal year 25 will kind of flip and go the other way for fiscal year 26. All right, so for a few years now, we've kind of had our eye on fiscal year 26 as being this pivotal shift in the district's financial position. And the main reason for that is not just the magnitude of capital expenditures, but also that a majority of those expenses are being paid from the district's fund balance reserves. Now, we do have proceeds remaining from the debt certificate issuance, plus interest that will be earned on those funds. And that's expected to cover about $28 million of expenses in the first half of the fiscal year. However, that also means that $41 million will be needed from the operating funds to cover the rest. Now, that money will come in the form of interfund transfers from a combination of funds, including the education fund, the operations and maintenance fund, as well as an abatement of the working cash fund. And again, those are going to fund a variety of projects, including project 2, the conclusion of geothermal project, as well as some design work for project 3 and building maintenance under our 10-year maintenance plan.
I have a question.
Sure.
How much from the ed fund specifically will be transferred?
That's a good question. I'm gonna jump ahead one slide here. So from the education fund, this column that is third from the right is showing the transfers between funds. So for education fund, it is going to be just over $22 million.
Okay, so what's the long-term plan for essentially like putting money back into that education fund? I mean, is this,
So a lot of this, it comes from, as we think back like the Atlas conversation, carrying, an initial fund balance that at times was nearing 100% of total expenditures. I would be concerned more like if we had an annual projection to keep transferring this money out. But when Project Two funding was discussed several years ago, and if anybody at CFC remembers that we're watching from afar at this point, it was determined that this is the amount of money that was sitting in fund balance that could be transferred for the construction that would all still leave us in a position to live within our 25 to 50% tightened fund balance policy. So long term, I don't foresee transfers of this magnitude coming out. It's kind of the timing of just while this construction goes on.
I guess. Maybe it's my misunderstanding, but it just seems like a little bit of a disconnect from what Graham was saying. We were explaining your, hypothetical framework for possible future referendum. Not that it's, definitely gonna happen, but just if we're taking 22 million out of the ed fund and then down the road, we're gonna say, oh, well, actually, we don't have enough to, make it the way we want it to. That's gonna be a hard story to tell. So it's really just a question on that. It's not a critique. I'm just.
Well, okay, so first of all, that decision to take from operating funds and put it into Project Two, that was made by the preceding board early 2023. I think that was done always knowing that the result was a right sizing of what our operating funds look like going forward. And it's not as though they were taking from a limited pool of operating funds at that time. They were taking from this very large fund balance that had been accumulated that something had to be done. That's what they chose to do with it. So are you saying that if at some point the district wanted to go to the community and say, you're asking us for a referendum, but look at what you spent this money out of operating funds? The response would be, look at the southeast corner of the building, because that's basically where those operating funds went. It's not like they.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't think that's. I think people understand like what's done, but I don't think that. Like a future plan of going for referendum. Is understandable, like to a taxpayer if you're pulling from the ed fund.
It would be the future referendum would be for additional capital projects, not operating revenue.
I understand like that the decisions are made. I'm just saying that like, if you want money for the ed fund, not for capital, that's gonna be.
Yeah, I don't think, I wouldn't foresee asking for that at any foreseeable future point. So I think the conversation about a referendum in the relatively near future would be related to additional capital projects and not related to operating funds or trying to build the fund. I don't think building the fund balance back up is an objective at this point, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I apologize, because I've probably just been using the term referendum too loosely, because I have to always be specific about whether it's an operating funds referendum or a capital funds referendum. That they're like two different animals, so, yeah, I think in the CapEx plan framework, that was also just assumed to be capital referendum bonds and not operating.
Right. I do think that this is going to be something that's going to come up for the next decade still of needing to explain this, and it's why transparency is going to be so important. In the 2005 to 2010, when District 200 was building up the very large education fund, the CFOs at the time said, well, we're eventually going to transfer that to capital and use it for building projects. In my opinion, they should have transferred it to capital 15 years ago, because that was part of their justification for keeping the phase-in on the tax referendum, the 2002 operating referendum with the phase-in 2005, was they were going to need that money for capital, and they were just storing it up. Again, why they didn't transfer it, it's water under the bridge. But I think there does have to be some messaging over the next couple of years, figuring out how to communicate that the excess in the ed fund was not necessarily always, but was often communicated as it was sitting there for the time when the capital would happen.
And any other comments or points anyone would like to make before I continue?
You'll be good here, Brian.
Okay. All right, so then, this fund balance summary slide really kind of gives us a picture of where the fiscal year 26 budget is positioning us. In the top half of the slide, we have the operating funds. Those are expected to start the year around $70 million. Then as you kind of move across left to right, revenues are estimated to exceed expenditures by $5.5 million. So I think that's kind of getting to that number that Cal was asking about earlier in the meeting. But then out of that $5.5 million, there is the $3.2 million that has to be transferred to the debt service fund to cover the debt certificate payments, which really leaves us with about $2 million of surplus at the end of the day. Now, obviously, a large portion of that plus more is being transferred out for capital in this case. But if you were to remove all of that from the equation, that's kind of what this budget would be looking at is about a $2 million surplus. So again, highlighted in blue here, we have a total transfers of $44 million moving from operating funds to non-operating funds in fiscal year 26. That amount is broken down as $41 million for capital projects, $3 million for debt service. And then fund balance in the operating funds at the end of fiscal year 26 will be about $30 million. And if we convert that to our percentage of operating fund balance to operating expenditures ratio, we're at 32% as of the end of the year. So in terms of our fund balance policy target range, 25 to 50%, fiscal year 26 is budgeted to finish squarely within that range.
Just one question that really isn't very important. Why is on debt service, they off by $2,100, the transfer versus the expenditure?
That is an expense that we pay to our bond consultants to file the continuing disclosure for us each year.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Brian, based on what you budgeted for 2026 expenses and capital projects, how much remains of Project 2 expenses beyond this coming budget year, if any?
It would be about $10 million left.
So with $4.5 million of fund balance, where does the remainder of covering that cost come from?
That will come from a combination of revenue from the state capital grant as well as Imagine Foundation donations. And then there is another transfer amount planned for fiscal year 27 to cover the difference.
Which fund does that come from?
That will probably come from education fund as well.
Thank you.
All right, so as we build our budget, the other thing we like to do is take a look back at the previous 5-year financial projection just to review where the budget differs. So these next 3 slides kind of work in tandem to identify some of those changes. On slide 15, we've got the operating funds again, and in the top line labeled total revenues, we're budgeting close to a 1% increase since the last projection. Certainly nothing substantial, but that difference largely comes from interest income. Last year at this time, the economists were forecasting several interest rate cuts on the horizon, but by and large, the Fed has kind of held those rates steady so far, which has worked out in the district's favor. In the expenditure section, the overall variance is an increase of close to 2%. The purchase services and other object lines highlighted in yellow are again the driving force behind that increase, as those contain the special education services and tuition expenses. Then at the bottom of the slide in green, the fund balance to expenditure ratio is now 4% lower than it was during the last financial projection. And I'm actually going to come back to that in just a minute, but first I want to jump ahead one slide and cover the non-operating funds. So revenues in the non-operating funds are trending lower because of that rapid decline in the CPPRT revenues. After back-to-back years of revenue shortfalls there, we have adjusted the budget to be more conservative in this area. So hopefully we will be back on track for that in fiscal year 26. Again, kind of taking a wait and see approach as well to see what type of estimates come out from the Illinois Department of Revenue later this summer. On the expense side, Tony kind of touched on this before as well. Those variances are largely due to just timing differences between fiscal years on the construction projects. The one exception would be the Project 3 expenses highlighted in gold. Those were not part of the last projection because the board had not yet approved any type of design work. So that is a new addition to the fiscal year 26 budget. The last item of note is the total transfers line, which shows $3 million more than previously expected. So with that shortfall in CPPRT revenues and the 1-year delay in the capital grant from the state, the district is having to use more from its reserves to cover expenses associated with the geothermal and the building maintenance work next year. So if we tie this back to the previous slide, that $3 million is coming out of the operating funds on the transfers line, and then reducing the operating fund balance to expense ratio by 3%. So this is also what makes discussions like the one we were having earlier in the meeting about capital plan funding so important. As the district starts to live within this new target range for fund balance, there's really going to be more competition between educational programs and initiatives and capital projects for the existing pot of money than there has been in the past. So just to kind of wrap things up here, as the budget process moves forward, there are still several areas of uncertainty like there is every year. Most of these have already come up at other points in the presentation, but I do want to call out the first bullet point because Cook County has indicated there will likely be another delay in fall property tax bills this year. While the length of the delay is still unknown, we do have a 2-month delay built into our assumptions within the preliminary budget. Obviously, anytime there is a change in cash flow for the district's largest revenue source, it will have a negative impact on interest earnings. So we will continue to monitor that situation as well as the other items on this list over the next few months. So that wraps up my presentation. Are there any other final questions from committee members?
Yes. So, you talked about special ed for about 6 minutes. You talked about construction for about 3. Special ed is a $1.6 million deficit and we got $100 million outside. So it would, moving forward, I don't want to do anything now, everybody wants to go home, but moving forward, if you could just tell us how the project is going, if it's on budget, if it's below budget, that would be awesome. If anything's come up where there's going to be another expense, that would be great. Also, let us know how our investments are going. What percentage, what's our average percentage? You remember a few years ago when COVID was around and things were 9%, we had 0% securities on the board. So everybody needs to kind of contribute to that in case we can get rid of something. And yeah, I would just say give the most important stuff as much time as you give. I mean, special ed, we can't really do anything about it. It's the law, but this construction project is kind of a big thing. But that's moving forward. We don't have to go over anything now. I'm not digging in here a lecture on anything. I'm just saying, so for the August meeting, I think we're meeting in August, give us some sort of a construction update. If it's more money, then we'll know it's more money coming out. If it's not, then that's great and we want to praise you.
Just say, and not to go too in detail, just as a reminder, you actually can track real time the construction budget and progress through our dashboard on the website. And right now, we are 100% on budget, on time, but it's something we're monitoring every month.
I know that, but you're ripped. You're sitting right here. Something came up, you would have known about.
Yep.
I'd be interested, it could be an August item, if you wanna go into more depth, but it could be also a 30-second highlight here too. I'm learning a little bit more of what the plans are with project 3, it looks like the architects are starting some work, just hearing kind of what the sort of scope, timeline, strategy is with that.
So that's capital plan,
Yeah,
Yeah.
what's that?
like the 10-year plan maybe.
Yeah, we can definitely move that forward. To clarify what the discussion is right now, we're just kind of in the exploratory phase right now, wrapping up the initial programming work for what needs exist for project 3. And asking the board in 2 nights to support moving towards just concept design, just high level boxes on a map to figure out what spaces might fit with solutions to those needs. And that work, if approved on Thursday night by the board, would then result in a presentation to the board in September. And so this meeting being in August is a really nice timing for that, to give kind of an update of where we are with the goal.
I would say we're strictly in needs assessment mode right now. The administration had brought forward kind of a larger lump sum to pay for that needs assessment, and the board said, let's tap the brakes, break it into smaller pieces. So we've had a couple of tranches of that needs assessment. More of it will come in the fall. But the cost that you pay the architect still has to show up as the CapEx section of it. So that's where we are, just strictly assessing.
I would say just for like, I don't know, whenever it works in the calendar. This is a high level, this much is going into. And you were showing also that, it's going, we're increasing just because of the salaries are increasing. But to me, that sort of just means you're doing the same amount of resource allocation for instruction. And I think with, we started the meeting with Brigham talking about, what matters to us as a district. And so if there are places where we're maybe not meeting the mark, then I think it would be important to make the connections where, okay, here's some resource reallocation that we might be looking at, you know, maybe equity isn't totally where it's at or whatever, right? So I think, that would make it meaningful as well.
Any other, you already asked for that, but any other future agenda items? Anybody? No, all right,
Did you also get Cal's request about the investment?
yeah, that's on the list of every year or every quarter. Look at the investments. So even if it's a quick 5 minutes, just to appease Cal, I know they're much better rates now, so don't worry. I think Brian's very good at monthly looking at that now,
Great job, Brian.
so we're
I
not,
appreciate you.
yeah, so we're not a bunch of zeros when everybody else is at 5. All right, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Second. Cal, Kathleen, all in favor, say aye. Aye, any opposed? All right, thank you.
See you around.